and welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and video show which brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from hundreds of successful individuals, role models from around the world. If you're new to the channel, please subscribe so you won't miss a new episode. I'm your host, Frits Bussemaker, and today I'm honored and privileged to have a conversation with Joris Merks-Benjaminsen. Joris, welcome to the program.
Good morning. And
Joris,
to be on the show.
Yeah. Hey, allow me to introduce you to our audience. You are a leadership trainer and author of the book Managing Without Power, which we'll definitely discuss during the podcast. Before you wrote that book, Director of Sales at Just Eat and Takeaway, 12 years with Google. Before that, lots of experience with branding, advertising, multi-award winning in marketing and branding. And you were voted the top 100, one of the top 100 marketeers for 3 years in a row in the Netherlands. So very strong background. As mentioned in the introduction, managing without power. When I read that title, the first thing I asked myself, because I found it to be like a contradiction in terms, managing without power. So first of all, what's your definition of power? What's power?
I think power, like the way I mean it in the title, is the power that is connected to the position that you have. So if you are a formal manager or leader, or if you just happen to be a very senior person, then that position comes with certain power that people give you, essentially. So they listen to you a little bit more easily. You can maybe force decisions, that kind of stuff. So that would be essentially, in my story, an undesirable kind of power, because it makes you lazy. The other way you could frame power is more the real power that's inside, and then it's more in like the courage to do the right things under pressure and those types of things.
Okay, well, we'll cover that a little bit later, because those are two types of power, one based on hierarchy and the other based on knowledge, charisma.
Yeah, and courage, I think.
Okay.
Wisdom, maybe. Yeah.
Okay, because when I had to read through the book, and for the audience, if I introduce, the book's introduced by the fact that it very much refers to your Google days, your 12 years at Google, and Google is notorious anti-management. It stripped all its managers of their power where they could, and that evaluations, decisions are based in groups. So tell me, well, take us through managing without power. What is that?
So what I don't mean by it is leading without authority, because that's often what people hear when they hear this phrase. But leading without authority focuses on those who do not have formal power, but can still lead. And when I use this phrase, I focus deliberately on those people that do have official power based on the role that they have in an organization. And the appeal I do on them is to lead and manage as if they don't have the power that is inevitably connected to their role. And it doesn't mean don't use it at all, but it means take a step back often enough to remember how you would lead and manage if you would not have that power. And then you start leading and managing with a lot more conscious attention, a lot more care downwards. And that's when positive things start to happen in organizations. But my observation is that particularly in very large organizations, there's a tendency from managers and leaders in all layers to have a little bit more attention upward than downward, which then leads to competition for attention from senior leadership. And that competition is pretty much the starting point of everything that undermines effectiveness and culture of organizations.
Okay, well, isn't that to some extent just human nature, that we all want to compete, no matter where we are?
Yeah, I think it's human nature, but you can, and some of that is even possible, because out of competition, you can also get self-improvement and development, you know, so there's nothing completely wrong with it. It's just wrong when the balance goes off, when competition becomes so strong that it goes at the cost of doing the right things for the organization.
Okay, so this also immediately triggers me the thought of it's reminding people to have have empathy. So you're always dealing with people. It's not a function or a feature you're dealing with in an organization. It's a person you have to manage. So there's an empathy side. Is that what it's about, or is it more?
Yeah. So in the book, in my trainings, I have a matrix. And that matrix is pretty much at the heart of everything I do.
Yeah.
And it's about the balance between leading based on human care, empathy, etc., on one axis, and the other one is accountability, clarity of direction, performance pressure. And you need both in a certain balance for a team or organization to be high performing. So if you're top right, both are high, that's when you're in a good space. And typically, it's very often startups that are actually in that space. And when a startup is founded by a person who has heart in the right place and knows very clearly this is why this startup was founded and where we're going, this is what we do, what we don't do, then you kind of automatically get a culture around that person that is in the nice balance. And at some point, that startup starts scaling, and you get the first line of managers below it, another line of managers below it. And then it can drift in two directions. And one is if there's lack of structure, lack of accountability mechanisms, no performance system whatsoever, then you get into what I call the top left quadrant. And I call that survival of the nicest. And it's a space where typically your colleagues are very nice, but you can get away with not delivering. And that typically means that stuff starts falling between the cracks. People are frustrated, they start pointing fingers, and then it doesn't get resolved. And then you keep going in circles, which is extremely frustrating, particularly if you are a person that genuinely wants to make a difference. So your talents actually start leaving at some point. And then the other way it can go wrong is if you're bottom right in the quadrant. I call that survival of the toughest.
Yeah.
And those are actually very often organizations that call themselves high performance organizations. But they actually overdid it on structure and accountability while being low on human care. And what you get then is a place where people with slightly thicker skin, sharper elbows survive more easily. But that happens to be the type of person that is good at taking care of themselves, but not so good at taking care of others. So you end up with a culture where people compete at the cost of what the organization as a whole needs to do. So where teams compete with each other and work in silos, where team members compete with each other and they compete for attention of senior leaders at the cost of attention downwards. And so you need that balance of both. So if you're in the top left, you probably need to dial up accountability and performance. And if you're bottom right, you probably need to dial up empathy, human leadership, etc.
Okay, well, you described implicitly for me like an ideal organizational model. I'm just picking up on the fact that you said, okay, about the whole, when you started to mention silos. Because in the past, that would be the ideal organizational model. We had these very structured silos. Everybody had their own P&L, and we would all report to the CEO. And that was the model to aim for, as it were. Okay, very simplistically said. But you're now advocating for a different organizational structure. And what's the cause of that change happening? Or you're proposing?
Oh, yeah, so it's not completely different. So if you think about that history of Google that you just referred to, right? So they were extremely anti-management, like literally from the start. It's ingrained in the way the Silicon Valley IT people and programmers think. They just thought of managers and leaders as useless middlemen and women, you know, and so they initially tried to just take away all manager roles in one go, and then discovered, okay, that becomes a mess, you know, doesn't work. And I think at that point in time that you still thought, okay, we just need flat hierarchy, self-steering teams, that kind of stuff. And then they discovered, okay, that's apparently a bridge too far. A few years later, again, they tried to prove that manager role should be removed from the company. But at that time, they had what they call the people analytics team. It was from Laszlo Bock, who was the vice president of people operations. He wrote work rules. And at that point in time, his vision was, okay, we will just do data-driven experiments the same way that engineers do A/B testing. We're going to do that for people challenges. And so they started the project to quantifiably prove that manager roles don't matter. And they ended up finding out the opposite. So they found that managers do matter, but then only if they behave in certain ways. And that behave in certain ways is what they published as Project Oxygen with 10 behaviors of great managers. And those are loads of investments in the team to make the team better, instead of just self-promoting to senior leaders, being in leadership meetings. Just spend lots of time with the team. And these behaviors have that balance between human care and direction and accountability baked in them. So what they did once they had that finding, okay, managers do matter, when managers are great, teams perform better, people are happier, culture is better. They essentially took those 10 behaviors and they designed an upward feedback survey from teams towards their managers. And they've been using that ever since. Like I left Google 2 years ago. I've been a manager in the organization for 6 years. And every 6 months, I was evaluated by my team on those 10 behaviors of great managers. And their evaluation counted for my performance assessment from my manager. So if I would have very low scores, that would cost me promotion, bonus, etc. So it's genuine power that you give to teams. And I believe that they did that to kind of create a slightly better balance between the power of the superior and the team, so that the superior is encouraged to invest more in teams.
Well, you obviously did it right, because you became one of the Google's highest scoring managers and trained fellow managers. Now, so far, when you talk about managing without power, you very much refer to your Google days, 12 years at Google. Could the subtitle of your book be Managing Without Powers, What I've Learned in My 12 Years at Google? Or does the book also contain lessons learned, insights you gained from experience working for other organizations? So how much is Google, how much, and what part is that's me? That's
definitely the second thing. So yeah. The reality is I had like a 24-5 year or so employed career in various companies, like about 10 different companies, starting in very small startups, but also in large corporates. 12 years of that was Google, so a really large chunk. But all of those 12 years I was customer facing. So I was working with Google's largest clients, which are typically all the large brands you see on TV and in advertising. The Unilevers of the world, the Booking.coms, that type of organizations of thousands of people. And in the past, I used to work with those companies on their brand and advertising strategies and marketing mix ROI questions. And that gradually shifted to digital marketing transformation around the time when digital advertising and e-commerce came up. And it's particularly in that period where I worked with lots of large marketing organizations on the organizational change that was required for digital transformation to happen, when I made most of my observations about the universal patterns. So essentially it is about the patterns of people in large groups in a certain hierarchy trying to achieve certain things, and then all the healthy and unhealthy behaviors that come from that. And then the method I am proposing by balancing human and performance, and I have a whole set of toolkit to get to consistent behavior of managers and leaders in all layers of the organization. What it essentially does is dial up as much as possible from the good and tune down as much as possible from the bad. So you create an environment where it's easier and more rewarding to do the right things. And the first moment I started seeing the damage of internal competition was when I worked with these companies on digital transformation, I initially focused on the strategic side of digital transformation. So I would have large marketing teams, traditional marketing teams combined with digital marketing teams, and then their online agencies, traditional agencies. I would have all of them in a room, and I would run a workshop with them, and we would have a strategic roadmap for the transformation they had to go through. And they were saying all the right things. They were saying smart things, and they came out with very thoughtful actions. And then I did that for like 3, 4, 5 years. And then most of these traditional organizations, nothing changed. I would just meet them 3, 4, 5 years later, and they were in the same spot, having the same conversations, defining the same actions. And so I was getting a bit frustrated about that. And then I wrote my first marketing book when it hit me why that was happening, why they weren't doing the things that I knew needed to happen. And the underlying reason was the fact because the digital departments, which were typically young people coming up, team becoming larger, they were internally competing with traditional marketing organizations, or the marketing teams, where the CMO typically is with knowledge of branding, knowledge of traditional media, knowledge of traditional retail, you know, and they were becoming smaller and didn't want that to happen, but they still had the power. So they were essentially internally competing, even though they have the same customer, even though both of them say they want to serve the customer throughout the customer journey. And they are competing to the point that they slow down transformation so that the company becomes at risk of going bankrupt because competitors are faster. And when I realized that, I wrote the title of my first marketing book called Schizophrenic Marketing, essentially saying, like, stop fighting. This is ridiculous. You have the same customer and you're killing the company both of you work for. Okay. And so that was the first moment I saw, okay, this internal competition isn't always great. And I realized that the main reason is unconscious leadership on top, because the leader is the one that needs to bring them together and that needs to create a situation where it pays off to do the right thing for transformation. And wrong KPIs coming from traditional leadership. So they had siloed KPIs. So they would shoot themselves in the foot if they would not compete. And that's when I realized, okay, if you want to change anything about an organization, you're going to have to start with the most senior leaders and then work your way downwards with all the formal management leaders in order to create an environment where it starts paying off to do the right thing.
Hey, it was a fascinating observation so far. Actually, I want to move it up a level, and when you told, I mean, you've written at least 2 books now. What's the urge? Why the urge to write books? Why are you writing books, which is such a hard thing to do?
Yeah, it's even so managing without power is the 6th one.
Wow. Yeah.
And so I have a history of 20 years being competitive in martial arts. I did like judo, aikido, boxing, kickboxing. And so at some point around 20 or so, I got myself injured in a way that was so bad that I can't do any type of sports anymore nowadays. Like I'll just like walking, stretching, and light fitness, you know, that's about it, cycling. And so my first book was actually in the transition from that moment when I realized, okay, I can't do that anymore. And I graduated university and entered work life. And the first 6 years or so, I was really unhappy at work. And because I was a bit naive, I think, when I entered work life, because I was so one-dimensionally focused on sports before that. And I thought, okay, I will just take my sports mindset, go to work. I will work really hard, train like you train hard, you know, then I will become good at what I do and people will be happy.
Yeah.
And that wasn't the reality. The reality was that there's all kinds of hidden political behavior in the office. And I had no clue what that was and where it was coming from. I could feel that something was wrong, but I didn't see it. So I felt really unhappy and unsafe. And I thought I was the problem. So I thought like, okay, I'm just not built to work in an office. And so that was the period when I wrote my first book. And it was called Samurai Business. And I took principles from martial arts to the working place. Because the insight that I had at that point in time, and that was also the insight that saved me. At first, I thought I was the only one. And then I noticed nobody likes this political environment. Yet they still play along with it because there's all kinds of prisoners' dilemmas in there. And so you have...
Yeah. So sorry, go ahead.
So you have this environment with lots of unhealthy pressures where you get political behavior, short-termism at the cost of long-term strategy, etc. And pretty much everybody hates that except a very small group of people who enjoys it. But once it happens, you have to play along because otherwise you can't function. So if you have a long career, somewhere 10 years down the line, you just know wherever I go, there's going to be at least a little bit of politics, and I need to learn to deal with that in order to be successful. And so I wrote Samurai Business kind of out of frustration, but also to help young people like me entering work life to say, like, listen, if you manage among all of these pressures to stay true to the business goals that matters most and to stay true to your values, and then you manage to be successful, that's when people start following you. It's essentially a form of leadership, like focusing on objectives and values under any kind of pressure. So that was my first book, more or less out of frustration.
Yeah,
And
because
then
you're describing writing a book almost as therapeutic, not in to convince an audience, so read my book, but more for yourself. Look, I need to just put it on paper to get it out of my system almost.
Yeah, and the same was true with that moment for schizophrenic marketing. I was just frustrated with working with these companies. And I think initially it was more like me just being unhappy in the workplace. And then the second one was being frustrated about the lost potential for these organizations. So I thought, like, okay, we're just going in circles. Nothing is improving. We're having the same conversations over and over again. Everybody knows it's rubbish. We're still not doing anything about it. And that kind of triggered the second book. And then Managing Without Power was then the last moment when I realized, okay, there's just nothing going to change unless you get all of these managers and leaders on board. And I bumped into the same patterns across organizations where attention was a bit too much upward at the cost of downward. The competition starts to happen, political stuff starts to happen. And then among the political environment, you also have the fuel for actually very toxic people to survive. And they actually damage people. So I saw all of that playing out like many times over and over again. And so that became, okay, I want to change that, you know? So I wrote the book, and now that's also why I train managers and leaders.
Yeah. Now, okay, well, come to that a little bit later. When you are, a number of people around me are writing books or have written books in the past, and sometimes I get the question, hey, can you proofread my book? I'm assuming you did the same thing. Who did you invite to proofread your book?
I had about, like, I think 10 or so proofreaders. And the most important thing I wanted to achieve is for it to be proofread by people who work in non-commercial organizations. Because my background is primarily commercial. And at the same time, I'm convinced that the patterns I'm seeing, they're not unique to commercial organizations. Because in the end, you're still people in a hierarchy trying to achieve a certain thing. And maybe there aren't very big bonuses, but there's still a promotion possible. And there's still an increase in when you have a promotion, increase in hierarchy, you get more power and a bit more money, you know. So and as long as there is some kind of structure, hierarchy, and goals to be achieved, and there are gains to be made, people will behave in certain patterns. And then the same thing is, people may not want to do certain things for certain bonuses, but they do want to be seen. They do want to be valued, you know, and even just being valued with a compliment is from the senior leader is also highly valuable. So I think the patterns are the same, but it's just slightly different nuances, slightly different wording. Okay. And I wanted to make sure that the words that I used didn't put off people working in governmental organizations, non-profit, etc. So I had loads of those proofreaders.
What motivates you?
I think it's two layers to it. So like, I think the most immediate urgency is just the frustration I saw about organizations not being effective, going in circles, and actually having seen how great managers and leaders can make a huge difference. The second is what it does to the happiness of people, because in the end, like so work life is an extremely large part of life of people.
Yeah.
And in organizations where there is too much competition, not enough care from leadership, then there's a small group of people who thrives by that, but about 2/3 of the people, they either disengage, or they leave, or they even get damaged and unhappy. And I think it's in that's where I think my deepest pain is, just that loss of potential for these people, the loss of energy from all of their lives, and in some cases even being seriously damaged.
Hey, I like to hear what motivates you, and that's taking care of people. That's at least what I'm hearing from you. Couple of more questions, Joris. I mean, time's moving so fast. First of all, where do you draw your inspiration from?
Yeah, so the interesting thing is, I get this question often, and in the past, the tendency is to look at some kind of single or maybe like some kind of famous person. And when I was doing my reflections going into this conversation, I figured that question might come, and I realized, you know what, it's actually not some kind of famous person. So the reality is my inspiration comes from the clients I work with, and it has always been the case. So when I was still in marketing and advertising, the thing I enjoyed most was just meeting a group of people and them trying to achieve a certain thing in a certain market, you know, and then they would tell me about their brand and their positioning. And very often the things they told about their brand, and you looked into what consumers were saying, there was a gap, you know, so that's already fascinating that they say all kinds of things, but there's a gap versus reality. Then just hearing about the dynamics of their market, dynamics of their organization, seeing some of them doing really well on certain things and other things not so well, and then being able to pick certain great things that you've seen somewhere and just complete the puzzle, you know? And I think that's what inspires me, just seeing people trying to achieve something. And most of the time, they're people that genuinely want to do something right. And they're in that pressure where it's very hard to do the right thing. And then they still struggle to figure out how to do it right. And just seeing that in many forms play out, and then playing a small role, dialing here and there, so you hopefully make it slightly easier for them to do the right things under pressure. I think that's where the inspiration comes from.
Good. That's very good advice, I think. And that's also a segue to my last question for yours. What's your advice to young managers starting their own career? Is there any tips and tricks you say, please consider this?
Yeah, so I have an opening exercise that I do with almost every training I do, and I call it Beauty and the Beast. So I ask people like, what do you love most about being in a formal management leadership position, and what do you find the toughest? And so enjoy most bit, that's typically where stuff comes out. Like I enjoy seeing people grow. I enjoy building with the team. I enjoy doing something more than I could do alone, you know? And then there's the other bit where it's actually a very wide range of things. So it goes from loads of admin is something that comes up very often, but also top-down pressure, unrealistic expectations, too many types of expectations, sometimes needing to defend decisions you don't disagree with. You know, like there's a whole bunch of pressures on every person, no matter how hard you are as a manager and leader. You're always in between somewhere, unless you're the CEO, but almost everybody's in between. And the reality is that you can't have one without the other. So when I had conversations with my team members and they said, I want to be a manager at some point, like the first thing I did is, okay, are you sure? Because you're going to get this too, you know? And so I think that's one. It's like you have to know that all these things that are annoying to the job, you're going to find them no matter where you go. They're not unique to your organization. They're part of the job. But the nice thing is, the more you invest in the good stuff, the easier the other bit becomes. And an example is, nobody likes firing people or giving people difficult feedback. But the more you invest in people early on, the clearer it becomes that you're just not getting there. And then by the time you need to fire them, you feel like, okay, this is just the only way this could have played out. I've done everything I can. I gave them every opportunity they could get, you know, and so if you then have to fire them, it's actually on the long run probably good for them. It's good for the team, because otherwise they end up just damaging the team. So you feel less bad about these bad things. So invest early in all the positive stuff, makes all the negative stuff a bit lighter, but you should never expect it to go away. Like you just go to a different organization, it's also there. It's part of the job.
Great advice. If you will become a manager, the good and the bad, it's a package deal.
Yeah.
Joris, I want to thank you so much for sharing your insights in your view, what it means to manage without power, and sharing your lessons of Google and the rest of your career. Again, thank you for being on The Brand Called You, and hope we're going to talk soon again. Thank you so much.
Cool. And looking forward to listen to even more episodes.
You're welcome. Please do.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to The Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for The Brand Called You.